In the previous lesson, we spent some time talking about the reconstructive theory of memory, as elucidated by Bartlett in 1932. This lesson is going to focus on a different theory of memory, known as the multi-store model of memory. Now, this is in fact a video that will touch on a number of elements that we've already explored in a previous lesson, the video concerning the idea of long-term and short-term memory. Now, this was a model of memory that was elucidated specifically by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968, Richard Atkinson and Richard Shiffrin, and is a foundational model that explains essentially, or attempts to explain essentially, how memory works. And the TLDR of this particular theory of memory is that memory is comprised of three separate stores, each of which has distinct characteristics. Let's think about this then in more detail. So beginning first then, there is this idea of sensory memory. The idea of sensory memory is the initial stage of the memory process, where sensory information, often from our environment, such as sound, such as sight, such as touch, is then stored for a very brief period. Sensory memory has a quite large capacity. It can take in all kinds of sensory information we receive. Think about the fact that if you're in a busy, crowded area, okay, let's say you're in a bar or a club or a party, you can probably take in a lot of sensory information. You've got lots of noises going around, you've got lots of lights flashing or whatever, and you might be able to, you might feel certain things, you might feel temperature or people brushing past you. This is all a high capacity amount of memory. It can take in all kinds of different sensory information. But the point is that that kind of sensory information is extremely short. You might acknowledge all that information, all that stuff going on around you, but you're not internalizing. You're not essentially processing and encoding that information into your brain. It just is there and then it's not. And so the result is that the sensory memory lasts only a fraction of a second to a few seconds max. For example, visual information, iconic memory, may last for around 250 milliseconds, and auditory information, echoic memory, may last for a few seconds additionally. Now, the process of sensory memory essentially is that it serves as a buffer for stimuli received through the sensors. Most information from sensory memory is quickly lost or discarded, but a small proportion of that memory, or information should I say, is transferred to your short-term memory if it is attended to. And so when thinking about short-term memory, it is the part of your brain that holds information for a short period of time after it has been attended to in sensory memory. This then acts as a temporary storage that allows you to hold and to process information that you are actively thinking about. Its capacity is also quite limited, although probably a lot more, or should I say a lot less limited than that of sensory memory. From a previous lesson, we noted that according to George Miller's famous work in 1956, the capacity of short-term memory is between 5 and 9 seconds. Capacity is 5 or 9 items, should I say. The time period is something else. We'll get to that in a second. So George Miller's famous work examines the capacity of that memory. So 5 to 9 pieces of information, or as Miller presented in the 1956 work, 7 plus or minus 2, which is 5 to 9. This is known as Miller's law, and it means that the average person can hold between 5 to 9 pieces of information in their short-term memory at any one time. The duration of this information is relatively short, usually lasting between 15 and 30 seconds without the rehearsal of that information. So it is significantly longer than sensory memory, which may last for around 250 milliseconds to only 1 to 2 seconds, but it is still not exactly the kind of memory that will allow you to recall information hours or days or weeks or months after an event. And this brings us to the idea of process, because the specification requires us to understand the importance of rehearsal in understanding and encoding memory into long-term memory. So to maintain information in STM, in short-term memory, rehearsal is required. Rehearsal is the process of repeating the information. Without this kind of rehearsal, the information decays or gets displaced by new incoming information. And so the result is that information in short-term memory can also be lost as the result of failing to rehearse that information. Additionally, it can be lost through interference or decay. Long-term memory, then, is the final permanent storage area of this memory system. It holds information for extended periods of time, ranging from hours to a lifetime. Its capacity is theoretically infinite, meaning that you can store vast amounts of information over time. Information in long-term memory can be stored also for long periods, sometimes in some cases for an entire lifetime. Now again, the process of long-term memory is that it is encoded through meaningful rehearsal and association. The information stored here can be retrieved back into short-term memory when it is needed. Long-term memory is divided into, as we mentioned in previous videos, explicit, declarative memory. This is the conscious memory of facts, sometimes known as semantic memory, and also the conscious memory of events, sometimes known as episodic memory. It is also then divided into that and to implicit memory or non-declarative memory, which is unconscious memory of skills, habits, and conditioned responses. And so, really, Atkinson and Shiffrin really present a model of memory that shows the kind of flow of information according to the multi-store model. Information enters sensory memory first through the senses. If we pay attention to this information, this is another point that is this is referenced in the specification. You have to know what it means to, or the importance of attention in storing of memory. If we were to pay attention to this information, it moves into our short-term memory, and it is here in the short-term memory that it is able to be rehearsed and manipulated. If rehearsal is sufficient and meaningful, then the information can be encoded into long-term memory for long-term storage. When we need information at a later date, it is then retrieved from long-term memory and brought back into short-term memory for active use. And so in terms of the key processes that are associated, we have the process of encoding, which is the process of converting sensory input into a form of stored memory. This is done through attention into the short-term memory process and then through rehearsal into long-term memory. This happens at each stage of the memory system, as I've just mentioned there. For example, in short-term memory, information is typically encoded acoustically by sound or by visually through sight, while long-term memory often is encoded semantically by meaning. We've noted this in previous lessons. Storage is the maintenance of the encoded information in the appropriate memory system, so sensory memory or short-term memory or long-term memory. And then finally, retrieval is the process of assessing information and accessing it from long-term information, from your long-term memory, should I say, bringing it back into short-term memory for short-term use. And so while the multi-store model is highly influential, it does have criticisms. The first criticism is, of course, that it is too simple. They oversimplify this model of memory. The model's distinction between short-term memory and long-term memory has been questioned, with research suggesting that short-term memory and long-term memory might not be as distinct as the model implies, that it's a lot more holistic, it's a lot more modular in the sense that it is not two distinct different modes of memory, that it might be a little bit more fluid. The model also places a heavy emphasis on rehearsal as a mechanism for transferring information from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. But some research also suggests that other factors, like meaning and organization, can play a role in memory consolidation, such that you don't necessarily even need to rehearse the information over and over and over again, but understanding its meaning and thinking about its organization is also another factor that is a useful way of being able to have that memory stored into your long-term memory. And then finally, as a modification, the working memory model, proposed by Baddeley and Hitch in 1974, challenges the idea of a single short-term memory store and instead describes a more complex system for handling and manipulating information in real time. So while the working memory model, as elucidated by Badili and Hitch in 1974, is not a complete volte-face and not a complete distinction, a complete U-turn from the multi-store model, it nevertheless modifies this model and implies that there is a lot more complexity associated with the short-term memory system, and instead proposes a working memory model that might be more illustrative of the complexities of memory and the way in which the brain processes memory.